Today we're going to talk about elections. We have a prime minister who's accused of abusing his power to, I guess, curry favor, perhaps, with a corporation or bully people into doing certain things that they may not have otherwise wanted to do, which could impact meaningfully the upcoming elections in October in Canada. So there are other elections taking place in the world. Canadians go to the poll in October. I'm sure a lot of you will be back home voting before you come back here. Some people speculate the tensions between India and Pakistan are motivated not insignificantly because India has an election coming up in a month or two as well. But the topic of today's discussion is the elections scheduled to take place in Israel on April 9th. So almost exactly a month and a day from now, Israelis go to the poll, and they have a relatively clear choice. You know, I mean, there are all sorts of jokes about, you know, to Bibi or not to Bibi, right? And that's a choice that Israelis are going to make again for the actually for the 6th time. Bibi's been elected prime minister 4 times. He lost once, and this is his 6th time running for the role of prime minister, and it's been all over the news. We'll talk about the corruption allegations. We'll talk about the intended charges and indictments for bribery, breach of trust, fraud. All of these are very serious allegations. They were summarized in a 57-page report prepared by the Attorney General, Avichai Mandelblit, and filed on February 28th. But I want to use the beginning part of the class to take a step aside from what you're seeing in the news, reading the newspapers, what you're watching on television, because there's an enormous amount of noise taking place in Israel and outside of Israel about a lot of things that the public is going to have a chance to weigh in on. And that's important because we take it for granted that Israel is a democracy and that it's a free and fair election that's going to take place for the 20th time in 70 years to have a 35th government. The government sometimes can get reconfigured in a parliamentary democracy without actually having an election. And I think we need to appreciate that this isn't something that most countries enjoy. Most countries are not free and fair democracies. And certainly no other country in the neighborhood is a free and fair democracy. So how did Israel get to be that way? You know, when we talk about democracy in the Western world, the way most of us were educated, we had the American Declaration of Independence extricating the colonies and the colonists from the rule of an autocratic monarch, George III, and whether the drafters of the Declaration of Independence were influenced by John Locke or other British philosophers who weighed in on the inalienable rights that certain people have. We'll open that to debate. But the truth is that our books, our sacred texts, have elements of democracy in them, but it's not inherently a Jewish thing, right? Jews were ruled by kings. There wasn't, David, Solomon, Saul, the first king, was not democratically elected. He was anointed by Samuel, by prophet. And then there was primogeniture. The oldest son would then take the place of his father and assume the kingship. And if he couldn't serve, the other son would take his place. We only had sons, we had kings. We had a queen, but it wasn't in Israel, it was in Persia. But so where does this come from? So when you think about contemporary Zionism, there are different points of origin, but a very convenient one is Herzl. And Herzl convened a Zionist Congress. The first one was in 1897 in Basel. He took it from, the word Knesset, parliament, comes from the post Second Temple period, where there was an assembly. Knesset means an assembly, but it also wasn't, it was an assembly of rabbis, of sages, but it wasn't a democratically elected Knesset. But the Zionist Congress was the first sort of contemporary Jewish body that took decisions as a Knesset, as a democracy, with proportional representation from various constituents that convened first in Basel and then other European cities incrementally in the very end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. In the Yishuv, we had 5 aliyot. We talked about this in previous lecture series. But in the Yishuv, they had something called the Asifah, the assembly, Asifat HaNivcharim, the assembly of or collection of representatives. And from 1920, 1928, every 4 years with interruptions, it was supposed to take place every 4 years, the various constituencies in the Yishuv, with the blessing of the British, who took over the mandate after the First World War, when they defeated the Ottomans, there were roots of democracy already taking place. And while Ben-Gurion and his colleagues were running around trying to put together munitions, trying to put together an army, trying to fuse the Palmach and the Haganah, and then later on the other fighting forces into one cohesive army, they were also planting the seeds of what they anticipated to be a democratic government. There was a Moetzet Ha'am, which is, a council of the people, and they prepared something called an Asefah HaMitkonenet, so that's sort of, that was to be charged with writing the Constitution before the War of Independence was actually won. They already anticipated having a constitution written by October. That never happened. And they actually then started, so they had an election for the Moetzet HaMedina HaZmanit, for the temporary provisional council, which then converted into the first Knesset in 1949. Actually, so there was never really a first Knesset. You had a Moetzet HaMedinit, and then you had the second Knesset. So the first Knesset to be called the Knesset was actually the second Knesset at the end of 1949. That's a lot of detail, but the reason it's important is because in all these various iterations, there wasn't a debate about political science. There was a lot of debates about politics, but there wasn't a debate surrounding what form of government was going to take hold in this nascent state. It was very clear that it was going to be a democracy. Now, democracy could be, deemed a fuzzy issue in various places, and there are some countries that are clearly not democratic, but people vote. People vote in Egypt, people vote in Jordan. They don't really vote in China. So they're in India. India is the largest democracy in the world, and it's a real democracy, and they're going to the polls. So there's some people who live in true democracies. There's some people who live in pretend democracies. Israelis live and thrive in a true democracy. Now, Ben-Gurion served 4 terms as prime minister, 2 non-consecutive consecutive terms. He served, he won the first and second elections, and then he resigned. Moshe Sharet was prime minister for 2 years, and then Ben-Gurion won 2 more elections to the Knesset. Like Ben-Gurion, Bibi has won 4 terms non-consecutively, but he's the first prime minister in Israel's history to win 3 consecutive terms. He won in 2009, 2013, 2015. This talk is not about Bibi, but because he has been prime minister of Israel for 13 years and for 10 consecutive years, and he's made the news, let's talk about him a little bit. I think it's important that we understand who he is, where he came from, what he's accomplished, before we sort of dive deeper into the weeds and try to analyze, where he is and where he might be headed. So, Benjamin Netanyahu was born in Israel. He was the first prime minister to actually be born in Israel. Yitzhak Rabin was born in what was then called Palestine, but and actually Yitzhak Rabin was the first first prime minister born in the land of Israel. Bibi was born in 49, a year after the country declared independence. He was the youngest prime minister ever when he was elected in May of 1996. He was 46 years old, and he had a remarkable childhood. His father is a very famous Zionist historian. He was the person whose father, Ben Zion Netanyahu, who died in 2012 at 101 years old, was a personal aide to Jabotinsky in the earlier part of the 20th century. Because of father's academic career, he lived in Philadelphia twice. That's why he speaks English as well as he does, with a slight Pennsylvanian accent. But he lived in Pennsylvania from the age of 6 to 9, and then again from 14 to 18. He graduated from high school there. And then he joined the Israeli Defense Forces, served in the elite army unit, Sayeret Matkal, with distinction for 5 years. He participated in several operations, some of which we know about, some of which we don't. He was wounded in action, which is a big deal, and don't take that lightly. I'm reminding you of all this because there have been certain allegations that he was running around New York taking acting lessons and was, indulging himself in cocktail parties while other people were fighting for the, for the good of the state. And I think those allegations are unfair. Netanyahu had an accomplished military service, and he got 2 degrees from MIT. He worked for the Boston Consulting Group, actually with Mitt Romney. They were colleagues in the mid-70s. His brother was the only Israeli soldier killed in the Battle of Entebbe, in the raid on Entebbe, in the hostage rescue. Hostages were killed, but he was the only member of the Sayeret Matkal, the same unit, who was killed in battle. Yoni Netanyahu. Bibi returned to Israel in 1978 to start an institute for Yoni Netanyahu. He went into business. He started meeting some political leaders, most notably Moshe Aarons, and he, who unfortunately also passed away very recently, a couple of months ago. And he was a very capable, very engaging person who was the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations from 84 to 88. He was a face that a lot of us saw for the first time on TV during the first Gulf War in January of 1991. And he was articulate, he was telegenic, he took over the leadership of the Likud party when Shamir lost the 92 elections to Yitzhak Rabin. And then he was the first prime minister in Israel's history to be elected directly. They had an experiment for 3 elections in 96, 99, and 2001, when successively Benjamin Netanyahu, Ehud Barak, and Ariel Sharon won the election for prime minister as a direct election. They thought they'd want to make the prime ministerial role a little bit more presidential. There were instances, including his first election, where the Labour Party under Shimon Peres got a lot more votes, but in a parallel election directly for the prime minister, Netanyahu eclipsed Peres by a very little bit. I remember when he was the ambassador to the United Nations, I was studying at McGill, and he came to speak. My dad and I were at a lecture, and he was unbelievably impressive. I mean, he's like, if you cared about Israel at the time, I mean, you sort of looked at this person and hoped that he becomes prime minister sooner than later, and then less than 10 years later, I was actually living in Israel, and I had the privilege of voting for him, the first time I voted in an Israeli election. He came into office with a very difficult mandate. He had to sort of continue a peace process that he didn't believe in. He had to satisfy an American government that he did not get along with. He had to deal with a president President Clinton at the time, that he clashed with. And he lost popularity quickly. He tried successfully at that time to instill certain domestic policy reforms that now we take for granted. But 25 years ago, Israelis were not allowed to own foreign bank accounts. They were very limited in investments they can make outside of the country. There were currency controls over their ability to convert shekels into any other currency. Prime Minister Rabin famously had to resign his position as prime minister because his wife had a bank account in the United States. So all those things changed in Bibi's first term, but nobody really remembers that. He also initiated a privatization program, which later on as finance minister, which we'll get to in a second, he accelerated. So he lost to Barak in 99. Barak was prime minister for even less time than Bibi was, till 2001, when he lost to Ariel Sharon after the Second Intifada and the collapse of the Camp David Accords at the end of Clinton's presidency. And Bibi wanted to take back the Likud from Sharon, but he insisted that they actually have general elections for the Knesset in 2001. That didn't work, so he didn't think that Sharon would win, and he thought if Sharon would win, he certainly wouldn't be able to preside over a stable government. He was wrong on both those counts, and then Sharon tried to bring him back in as he's foreign minister for a brief period, but as finance minister when Israel was going through an economic crisis. Remember, this was 2003. So now we remember 2008 as being a big financial crisis. But after the internet bubble collapsed, I mean, the stock market dropped 55% from peak to trough in 07 to 09, but it also dropped over 40% from peak to trough from 2000 to 2002. And Israel had, NASDAQ and Nablus. There was also struggling through a second intifada. People were going there. Being finance minister of Israel at that time was a recipe for political, suicide. But he took the job and he did it very well. He made a deal with Sharon. You don't interfere with my economic financial reforms, and I won't interfere with your, military and foreign policy engagements, and that deal worked. It worked well, and the banks were privatized, the oil refineries were privatized. Anything that had not been left undone in the first round of easing capital controls, foreign currency controls, all of that disappeared. And now it's hard to even remember an Israel that had such anachronistic limitations on their citizens' ability. I mean, it's a sign of insecurity if you don't let people take money out of the country. In some cases, it's justified. But in Israel's case, certainly today, it's not justified at all. I mean, there are Israelis all over the world doing very well in business, but the people who are doing best in business are those who stayed in Israel and invested in that country, because it's been a tremendous 20 years. But Bibi famously resigns from the finance ministry after the second time. He threatened to resign once if Sharon disengaged from Gaza, and Sharon said, well, go ahead and resign, and then he didn't resign, and then he said, well, you have to put it to a public referendum. Sharon did not want to put it to a public referendum. For those of you who were living in Israel or visiting Israel at the time, this was what I call the Shmata Wars, where you had either an orange or a blue ribbon affixed to your antenna. And it was very divisive. It was very divisive, and you were either deep orange or deep blue, and there were no colors on the spectrum in between. So there was a Gaza disengagement, and then Sharon gets a stroke. Olmert becomes prime minister instead. Bibi takes back the Likud, because Sharon left the Likud and started Kadima, which would have been a very strong party. It's a bit of a weaker party with Olmert and Livni than it would have been with Sharon. But anyway, Bibi rebuilds his political capital in opposition from 2006 to 2009. And then in 2009, he runs, he loses, but he becomes prime minister. He loses by a couple of seats. Tzipi Livni actually had. Olmert was on his way out, facing his own set of corruption charges, and he was actually served 18 months in prison. He got out last year. But, which is also the sign of a democracy. I mean, if you think about it, there aren't that many countries where you have a prime minister who served time. You had a president. I mean, Katza, interestingly enough, I mean, Shimon Peres passed away in 2016, so we're not going to talk about him during he's not part of this election, but he lost to Bibi the first time, and then he ran for president once and lost. Katzav won, to the surprise of everybody, and then Katzav was charged with rape and imprisoned, and Peres became president. So you've had a president, you've had a prime minister, you've had several ministers. Gonen Segev is another fellow who's Minister of Energy. He's now sitting in prison. Aryeh Deri sat in prison. There was a joke saying that when Israeli politicians ask one another for their cell numbers, they're not talking about phones. But you have Bibi winning the 2009 election because he and Barak colluded, if you will. They decided that they would be able to sit. Barak had very few votes, but he was head of the Labour Party, and he was Bibi's Minister of Defense for that his second term in office. Now I'm going to say his first of the 3 consecutive terms. And then Bibi ran in 2013 and won fewer votes, but he was able to cobble together a very strong, what appeared to be a very strong coalition with Yesh Atid, which was the newcomer. We're going to talk about newcomers in a couple of minutes, and the Jewish Home, Habayit HaYehudi. So, because we've mentioned in previous classes that politics have become very personal. You have, when you say Yesh Atid, I need to say this is Yair Lapid, right? And if we say the Jewish Home, then it was Naftali Bennett. It's not Naftali Bennett anymore. Naftali Bennett, Ayelet Shaked, spun out just a few months ago to form a new party called the New Right, but the Jewish Home still exists and they merged with Otzma. But when we dissect the players that you should, the scorecard that you should be looking out for in April, we can look more carefully at who the personalities at the top of the ticket are. But in 2013, was the first time in a very long time that the ultra-Orthodox are left out of the governing coalition. And there was for some consensus, but there was a broad swath of public opinion that they've gotten away with too much for too long, they've received too much for too long, and they're not, Shivyon Banetel, they're not bearing their fair share of the burden, particularly when it comes to military service and also their disproportionately low participation in the labor force. If you look at labor force participation, the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs are just like off the charts down. It's changing, by the way, for a separate lecture, for the better, particularly in the Orthodox community, but nowhere near the rest of the population, and nowhere where it was, 6 years ago it was worse than it is now. But inevitably, there's some internal fights there. So you have Tzipi Livni with Hatznua, you have Kadima's done, you've got Yair Lapid, who has 19 seats, similar to what his father had. Tommy Lapid had a company called Shinui. Ran once, got 19 seats, and then disappeared. There are a lot of these episodic centrist parties. The country is clamoring for centrist politicians. And unlike the United States, where you're really going to have two parties, if we had a different political system in the United States, Michael Bloomberg would still stay in the race. He announced this week that he's not going to be running for president, but he realized earlier on that his only path to the presidency would be through a Democratic primary. And he is so far away from where the Democratic Party is right now that he wouldn't stand a chance in the primary process, and he understood that. And even though he's worth $40 billion approximately, whatever percentage of his money that he wanted to devote to this exercise wouldn't be able to overcome a party that's moved in a very different direction from that centrist element. Israel hasn't. Israel still is. It's moved to the right, incrementally, but there's still every election there is a party that is like the great hope for middle ground. In the last election, it was Kulanu, Moshe Kachlon. He got 10 seats, and he would have had I think even maybe one or two more if Bibi didn't in 2015. Before we get to the present, 2015, Bibi and the Zionist camp, Hamachaneh Tzionei, which was Bushi Herzog, who's now the head of the Jewish Agency, and Tzipi Livni got together. They formed their Zionist union with Hatznua and Labor, and they were running neck and neck in the polls. They were both polling at about 24, 25 seats. Ultimately, they got their 24 seats, and the Likud got 30. And the reason they got 6 more seats was they probably took a couple away from Bennett, they took a couple away from Lieberman, and they took a couple away from Kachlon. Because Bibi was saying that the Arabs are being bussed to the polls in droves. And then he also said that there will never be a Palestinian state on my watch. And immediately thereafter, he apologized to the president for saying something that sounded a bit racist and saying something that completely undermined agreements that he had with the administration at the time. But he didn't care because he won. So the apology is like the retraction that you see after an obnoxious headline on page D37. It doesn't really have the same impact as the initial statement. So Bibi's now prime minister for the 4th time, and he only, it's in the bylaws that you have to hold elections every 4 years, and so it was clear that this year there was going to be an election. It was moved up a little bit because of frankly because of the scandal. I think that initially there were going to be elections sooner when Bennett threatened to pull out of the coalition after Lieberman pulled out of the coalition. Lieberman decided that he wanted... So now let's talk about the current election. The current election was precipitated. The timing of this election was precipitated by Avigdor Lieberman, who was the defense minister. Bibi formed his coalition with 61 seats in 2015. So even though he got 6 more surprise seats, he waited till the absolute last minute of the deadline that he was given by the president to form a coalition. You're given 6 weeks. He had 2 hours left in his 6-week period, and he got 61 votes. You need 61 votes. So you got the barest of minimums. Remember, there are 120 seats in the Knesset. He did it with 2 hours left to run, and Lieberman was not in his coalition. And Lieberman and Bibi Lieberman was his chief of staff the first time he was prime minister and an advisor. Then he went to form his own party. And remember, this was in 96 when Bibi was first elected. This was right after the wave of approximately 1 million people from the former Soviet Union coming to Israel, which is about 20% of the country's population at the time. So it was a huge, huge influx of human capital and new voters. So the first sort of Russian oriented party was Sharansky's. He got 7 votes in one election, and then 2 in the next, and then completely disappeared. So Lieberman sort of picked up that mantle, and Yisrael Beitenu, Israel's our home, is now considered to be sort of the Russian party. It leans to the right, as that segment of the population does. And Lieberman did not join the coalition. Netanyahu had a spat with his defense minister, Moshe Bogi Ya'alon. So Ya'alon resigned, and Lieberman then got the post of defense minister, which he liked. But his party wasn't really going anywhere, and he felt that he was crowded out. So he used the first opportunity when there was another skirmish with Hamas last year to say that we did not retaliate forcefully enough. And therefore he's resigning his position as defense minister. Cynics claim that was a ploy to seem like he's tougher than the prime minister. In any event, they didn't need him. They still had 61 without him. But then Bennett said, make me defense minister or I'm quitting the government. And Bibi sort of looked at, and Bennett, by the way, is also an impressive person. Bennett also served at Sayeret Matkal. His parents are American. He grew up in Israel. He was a high-tech entrepreneur. He co-founded a company called Sayota. It was sold for a lot of money. I mean, he himself made tens of millions of dollars. And he essentially picked up a party, the Jewish home. It was called the Bayit Yehudi. They renamed it. It's a legacy Mafdal, which is now they think of it as a settlers party, but historically it was the Orthodox Zionist party. For those of you approximately, looking around the room in terms of ages, Zvulun Hammer was the person who led that party in the 80s and 90s. And then it sort of receded from mainstream political landscape, and now he resuscitated it and got 12 seats in 2013. But only 8 or 9 in 2015. So, and now he's split away again. But he didn't do that yet. So he threatens to leave the government if he doesn't get the defense ministry, and Bibi sort of laughed at him. Yes, you would bring down the government, but you would then also be responsible for maybe electing a left-wing government in Israel. Go tell that to your constituents. Go tell your constituents that you're the reason why Bibi, their hero, was toppled in favor of, who knows, Avi Gabay. And so Bennett tried to dance away from that, and he said, "Okay, fine, I'm not going to leave." He retracted his ultimatum, but then the heat was on these corruption allegations. So I'm going to assume that all of you read this ad nauseum, because I have. But let me summarize this for those who haven't digested every word on every page. Over the past 6 months, there are 4 cases. There's case 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and 4,000. Case 1,000, very briefly, deals with improper gifts. So Bibi was given gifts by several people. The 2 most famous are extraordinarily wealthy businessmen. Arnon Milchan, who's a Hollywood producer, mostly cigars and champagne, and the other is James Packer, who's an Australian, businessman as well. So the allegations here, particularly in the Milchan case, is that Bibi got 1 million shekels, which is about $280,000 worth of goodies, in exchange for helping him get a visa, a special law, which is really, running a gray area in money laundering, but that enables you to essentially not declare any of your investments for 10 years. It's a 10-year holiday on declaring you're getting taxed on investments. And the interesting thing there was that he wasn't charged with bribery there, he was charged with breach of trust. The second case, called Case 2000, has to do with the Yediot Achronot, which is Israel's largest paid circulation newspaper. It's been eclipsed by Israel Hayom. Yediot Achronot tends to lean a little bit to the left of center. If you've got Haaretz, which is a little further to the left. Yediot is still mainstream, but pretty critical of Netanyahu. And Noni Moses is a powerful publisher, so he was very, very much threatened by Sheldon Adelson's essentially bankrolling a free newspaper. So you don't have to be Israeli to like free stuff, but it helps. And therefore, a lot of people were just reading Israel Hayom, and obviously these are old world media platforms that are struggling to survive in the day of the internet and free content. So advertisers are spending more money on Google and Facebook now than they are on print media. So Moses wanted to cut a deal, and there's some pretty apparently shocking exchanges. But that deal never took place. Does it have to take place for a breach of trust? Probably not. Vanderbilt doesn't think so, because he actually filed a breach of trust claim against Bibi, but not bribery, although he intends to file a bribery charge against Noni Moses, so that's unusual. Case 3000 never even made it to the charge sheet. It involves probably bribery and corruption in the whole world of the submarine purchases. Israel got some very, very good deals on submarines from the Germans. ThyssenKrupp was the manufacturer of the submarines, and Bibi's lawyer apparently lined his pockets, but Bibi was not involved. So we go from case 2000 to 4000, which is where he has been charged with bribery, whereby the accusation is that he instructed the Minister of Communications, he was the Minister of Communications, the people in the communications ministry to help Walla in its merger with Bezek and all sorts of other goodies and favors that Shaul Elovitch basically collectively benefited to the tune of about 1.8 billion shekels. To translate that into US dollars, we're talking about half $500 million. So that's a lot of money for anybody. So Bibi didn't get the money, but the argument might be that he got help in getting reelected. So maybe to someone like Bibi, that's priceless, but that's where the bribery charge is likely to get leveled. So it's complicated, but not overly complicated, what an Israeli prime minister can or cannot do when they're facing these charges. They can continue serving as prime minister. So there's nothing to stop Bibi legally from running in this election and continuing to serve as prime minister, even if, and if he wins, continue cobbling together a coalition. There is a question as to whether or not, so the indictments that were filed are pending a hearing. And the idea of bringing this up is that Bibi was hoping that he would be able to apply pressure on the Attorney General not to file these charges if he was not going to be able to have a hearing before the election actually takes place. And there's a powerful argument to be said that by filing charges publicly in a 57-page report, without a hearing doesn't give the Prime Minister a chance to defend himself before the Israelis go to the poll in an effort to exculpate himself and have the right to prepare and deliver a defense. It's a legitimate argument. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with it, but I think that argument can be made. I do think it's important, if you choose to make that argument, how you make that argument. And the Prime Minister made a choice of making that argument in a rather vociferous way, and without pulling any punches against his own appointed Attorney General, against the police, against the Department of Justice. Frankly, in a way, and you don't hear the rhetoric as much. I don't know how many of you listen to the Israeli radio or watch Israeli television or read the Israeli press, but I don't think very much could embarrass our president, but this would come pretty close. I mean, these are very severe allegations when coming from a prime minister at the administration of justice, at the court system, at the media, at the police. It's troubling, and that's where I think his challenge is going to be. If he wins, or if he doesn't win. If he doesn't win, then I think he's going to. I don't know what he's going to do. I suspect, depending on what the outcome is, he will have a choice of trying to hold on to his leadership position within Likud, or try to defend himself as a private citizen. But what happened after these allegations were made and elections were called? A fellow by the name of Benny Gantz decided that he's going to form his own party. After Moshe Ya'alon, Bogi Ya'alon was, we talked about him, he was the defense minister in Bibi's government from 2013, 2016, and definitely considered to be to the right of center. He was the Israeli chief of staff from 2002 to 2005. Chief of staff is a big deal. You're a Rav Aluf. You are the top general in the army, and there's only one of those. And there haven't been that many in Israel's history. And normally you serve 3 years and get an automatic 1-year extension. He did not get a 1-year extension because he publicly opposed Prime Minister Sharon's disengagement from Gaza. So he only served 3 years, but he publicly opposed Sharon. Sharon's not a leftist. Sharon, by the way, was not a chief of staff. Being a chief of staff is a big deal. Rabin was one, and he was prime minister. Barak was the chief of staff, and he was prime minister. Barak was the only person who's won an election for Labor since Rabin. And Rabin, was the only one to win an election. Golda Meir, Rabin won an election in 1992. So the Labor didn't win any elections from 1973. Well, 77 they lost. They won 73. They lost in 77 to Begin. And then they didn't win again until they had a chief of staff in 1992. Then they won again when they had another chief of staff in 1999 with Ehud Barak. They don't have any chiefs of staff now. But Benny Gantz was a chief of staff also. And Bogi Ya'alon, Benny Gantz was chief of staff much later. So we talked about Ya'alon was 2002, 2005. Benny Gantz was chief of staff from 2011 to 2015. So he was chief of staff, and during the 2014 war in Gaza, Bibi was prime minister during the entire time that Benny Gantz was chief of staff. He decides that he's going to now run with his own party, Choshen Yisrael, and Bogi Ya'alon joins him. So they're polling at, I'd say the high teens. Pretty much after they announce, and Bogi Ya'alon and Benny Gantz, you have 2 chiefs of staff. That's pretty cool. You hardly ever have one, and here you got 2 chiefs of staff. And now the question is, who are they going to take their votes from? You're getting 18, 19 votes in the polls. Where are they coming from? They're coming mostly from Labor, which is a party very much in decline, and also from Yesh Atid, from Yair Lapid. Yair Lapid is the son of Tommy Lapid, who was a political commentator. Yair Lapid was a political commentator, TV personality, radio host, a very likable guy. He's like, think of an Israeli Ellen DeGeneres, you know what I mean? He's a guy that people like to like. But he's not a chief of staff, he's a little fellow, and I'm a little fellow, and I'm calling him a little fellow, but he's a nice guy. He's a nice guy. He drives himself around. He doesn't, I remember I was at a dinner with some other people with him, though, and we're walking outside, and he's, the person pulls out the car, gets out of the driver's seat, gets into the passenger seat, and he's the driver's seat. It turns out that the person who pulled up the car and got in the passenger seat was his wife. So not only does he drive his own car, he drives with his wife, she gets the car. He's a nice guy. But he was going to lose votes, this Benny Gantz guy, because people are all concerned about security. Israeli elections ultimately, always pivot around the security issue. Sometimes it's a threat of the Palestinians, sometimes it's a threat from the Iranians. But even when Bibi was elected in 1996, his slogan was Shalom Bitachon, peace with security. So now there's all this jockeying. Everyone's saying, you guys really need to combine. The big allegation, self-incrimination, going on in the center left of Israel is, how are we going to beat Bibi? And I'm the one to do it. I'm the one to do it. No, I can do it. I can do it. And meanwhile, they're all sort of tripping all over themselves to be the great savior, and they never really combined forces. They didn't even look, historically, the Arab list, which was a very, the Arab list is an amalgamation of four parties that didn't talk to each other, and they disintegrated. They wwere united for one election, but they won an unprecedented number of seats. They got, 13 seats in the last Knesset, which was, more than collectively they ever got in pockets. Avigdor Lieberman wanted to diminish their role in the Knesset and came up with this higher electoral threshold of 3.25%, which, as I was told you in the previous class, means that if you don't have 4 seats in a Knesset, you have 0. So that's the minimum that you're allowed to have before you can even sit. See, there's no person with 1 seat. So you have these 2 chiefs of staff talking to Lapid, and it would be very hard for them not to want to do a deal. And then you had Orly Levy Abekassis, David Levy's daughter, who had a party called Gesher, and she was trying to get her way in. And they ultimately felt they didn't really need her, and they didn't really want to do the same deal that Bibi midwife between Otzma, but we'll get to the right in a second. So they wind up doing a deal. And Gabi Ashkenazi, who's a very popular, also former chief of staff, decides to join as well. So now you have, and they renamed themselves a Blue-White Party. You have 4 people at the top of the ticket. You got Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, Moshe Ya'alon, and Gabi Ashkenazi. Gabi Ashkenazi is a bit like Yair Lapid, but he actually was the chief of staff. He's a likable guy, and he's certainly someone you want to sit down and have a beer with. And but he was also the chief of staff right before Gantz. He was chief of staff from 2007 to 2011. He served his he got the full year extension, and Gantz got the full year extension. The person, incidentally, between Ya'alon and Ashkenazi was Dan Chalutz, who was the first head of the Air Force to be a chief of staff, but he took a lot of flack for the 2006 fiasco in Lebanon. So, like Amir Peretz as defense minister, he also resigned his position as chief of staff, and Gabi Ashkenazi took that place. So now you've got a party, right? Bibi is considered to be a very, swarthy, military expert, defense expert, tough on security. I'm not taking that away from him. I mean, I sort of ran through his resume. I've got a lot of respect for the many things that he's done, but you've got 3 chiefs of staff who are polling ahead of him. They're polling now at about 35, 36 seats out of 120. Likud is at about 30. One of the more interesting things that happened is that they did not really lose very much as a result of the indictments. So what this proves is like what Trump said in the Republican primary in 2016. I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and my supporters will still root for me. I think some of his supporters are rooting for him to go on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody. I think there's some people who are rooting for shots being fired the other way. But without talking about violence, it just demonstrates that the political dynamics are such that if you have such passionate feelings for a particular politician, then that politician has a lot of leeway in terms of what they can say, what they can do, and most importantly, what they can be accused of having done or having said. So it looks like the Likud is going to hold on to its approximate number of seats if nothing really changes between now and April. And then it really becomes a matter of math. And this is what really drove the Prime Minister to bully the remnants of the Jewish home. So now let's dissect the right, and then we'll dissect the left. So on the right, you've got Likud with their 30. You've got Naftali Bennett had a party of 9 seats, someone split off, but he decided to now join the New Right, and he's polling at about 6 or 7 seats, maybe 8. And now so he's now called the New Right. He still wears a kippah, but the New Right has nothing to do with the religious Zionism. The New Right is strictly an ideological party. Ayelet Shaked, his deputy, who's now serving as justice minister, is completely secular, as are most of the other members of the party. The 4th on their list is Caroline Glick, whom you know from the Jerusalem Post. So she'll probably get into the Knesset because they're polling. They're not really at risk of not passing the electoral threshold. So the New Right will probably get about 6 or 7 seats, and the Jewish Home, which now includes Tkuma and Otzma, which was the Jewish Power, Jewish Strength Party that we talked about in the last class, they're polling at around 5 or 6 seats, right? So collectively, these two factions are going to have about 13 seats. You add that to Bibi's, 30, maybe they'll have 14 seats. And then, so you get to, 43, 44. Lieberman, Yisrael Beitenu, is clearly, a right of center party. The irony that here the author, the progenitor of this electoral threshold is at risk of losing his own representation in the Knesset because he's polling at about 4 seats. But the Russians who tend to support him tend not to poll accurately. In other words, they're historically, they've always surprised, even Yisrael Baliyah, Sharansky's party was polling at 2 or 3 seats when the threshold was lower. They got 7. Lieberman at one point had 15 seats in the Knesset. He was supposed to get 10 or 11. So I'm pretty confident that he gets into the Knesset with at least 4 and probably 5 seats. So that gives them a bit of a boost, maybe takes now the right-wing bloc from 43 to about, let's say, 48. And then you've got the ultra-Orthodox and Shas. So the ultra-Orthodox are polling at around 7, and Shas is polling at around 6. People think Shas sort of have the opposite. They're very, you have some people who say they're going to vote for Shas and wind up voting for Likud. But, so now the ultra-Orthodox together will get about 12 or 13. So if you add that up, you get to your 60, 61. And that's what Bibi's relying on. And if you didn't push Otzma and Habayit HaYehudi together, in all likelihood, neither one of them would have passed the threshold. So now they would have gone from having maybe the equivalent of 3 seats and the equivalent of 2 seats, which would have meant that they would have had no seats, to getting 5 seats. And that's what he did. It's not that he's a racist. It's not that he wants to resuscitate the legacy of Kahana. Mayor Kahana, who started the Kach party, sat in one Knesset from 84 to 88. He was then banned, because you can be banned if you are either anti-Zionist, threaten harm to the Jewish state, or incite violence and racism. So Otzma is clearly a racist party, but they aren't inciting violence. So that's why the elections committee decided to. They're not directly inciting violence. If people are shaking their heads. They have a very obnoxious, to my view, platform that really smacks of racist inclinations. But unlike their ideological guru, Mayor Kahana, they're not inciting direct violence. They're advocating for a peaceful transfer of the Palestinians and the Arabs out of the state of Israel. They're advocating for a peaceful imposition of laws where Jews can't marry Arabs. They're advocating for a lot of other peaceful things that we probably find abhorrent. But they're also likely to be in the Knesset with one person. So there was a lawsuit filed by Meretz to the Central Elections Committee to have the party barred and to have certain members barred. And there was a ruckus on the Knesset floor a couple of days ago when they tried to file a libel suit against Stav Shafrir for calling them Nazis, and because she equated their legislative platform to the Nuremberg laws. And then there was also a movement by them to get rid of Balad and Birkasit, who are anti-Zionist, and the Central Election Committee actually let that pass. But if you're reading about, oh my goodness, the Central Election Committee barred this party and barred this candidate, no one's getting barred until the Supreme Court, intervenes, and the Supreme Court won't have time to intervene before April 9th. So you can assume that all the parties who are running, despite all the noise and the recommendations of the Attorney General and the pronouncement of the Central Election Committee, no party, maybe they get kicked out of the Knesset retroactively, but all the parties who are slated to run in the election on April 9th will be eligible to run at that date. So we handicapped a little bit the right, and we added in the religious parties, but I think we need to file the religious parties. So we can get from 48 to 47, 48 was where we were. You add the 12 to 14, and then you get to your 60, 61, maybe 62. But I don't know that we need to put those in automatically, because now let's go to the left. Blue and white is polling at about 35, 36. Labor is polling at about 6 or 7. Meretz is polling at about 5. So if you add all that up together, you also get about 48. All right, and then you get the Arabs, who have about 12, maybe 13. They didn't get their act together, but they didn't do. They're at risk of losing the 4 or 5 votes because they split up. So there's a possibility that, you know, the Ta'al faction will definitely get their 7, 8 seats, but the Balad faction get about 4 or 5. They won't get more. So if you get the 8 and the 5, you got your 13, or 8 and 4, you got your 12. If you get your 8 and slightly less than 4, they're out of the Knesset. So all the Arab parties will have gone from 13 to 8, and those other votes will get redistributed. So it's complicated. If that happens, then it'll certainly weaken the Arab representation in the Knesset, but it'll make all the other parties that much stronger. So those 5 votes that they didn't get, you know, at least 1.5 would go to blue and white, 1 would probably go to Likud, and you'd have that distribution among those who did pass the threshold. So, can the center form a government with the Arabs? Right? If we wind up with a scenario where blue and white has 36, Labor has, call it 7, and 7 or 8, and Meretz has 5 or 6, and they have, like, let's say collectively 49, and they need 12 from the Arabs in order to form a government. Can they do that? And the answer is no. They really can't. I don't think that they would be deemed a legitimate governing bloc, a governing coalition with the Arab, needing the Arab parties. Very important. Arab parties have served in coalitions from the beginning of the state. Ben Gurion had the Arab parties, and it was a slightly different Arab population. You didn't really have Arab nationalism as a movement at the time. You had people, they weren't fully. They were legally fully citizens of Israel, but they weren't as empowered, as enfranchised. Obviously, the country was going through a completely different set of challenges. But Arab parties sat in early governments as coalition partners, but they weren't needed. They weren't needed. It was comfortable to have them there. It looked good to the rest of the world, but they weren't required in order to reach the 61 vote threshold. Today they would be, unless, let's go back to what we filed, Gantz and Lapid, Lapid would be tough, right? Because Lapid famously agreed to join the coalition with his 19 seats back in 2013 because he thought that he was elected largely to diminish the disproportionate role and influence of the Orthodox parties in Israeli politics. So it would cost a lot of money to get the Orthodox onto the center. In other words, the price they would have to pay would be higher to include them in a coalition. So if you look at the landscape, it would be more likely for a Likud-led right coalition to form a government than a blue and white center coalition to form a government if they need the Arabs. Which means that there's so many different scenarios, and the elections are still a month and a day away. But that seems to be where a lot of attention is focused, and that's I think, in my view, a very good explanation for why the Prime Minister was as aggressive as he was. I think longer term, it's not going to help his legacy at all. But he doesn't care. He wants to get elected. He doesn't care about what the AJC thinks. He doesn't care about AIPAC thinks. All he cares about is 61. Which brings us to another scenario. There is another scenario where the numbers come out approximately the way we look at it. And, interestingly enough, we talked about every single time there's a sort of a great centrist hope. You had they actually called themselves the Center Party in '99 when Yitzhak Mordechai and Amnon Lipkin Shachak, another chief of staff, got a big chunk of votes, and then you had Shinui, which we talked about, and then you had Yesh Atid, and then you had Kulanu, Kachlon, and the last one, Kachlon, Bibi could not have formed a government without him, and Labor could not have formed a government without him. So what he could have done is he could have just said, I'm not joining a government unless the two of you join together. But then he was afraid that he wouldn't get the finance ministry position that he so coveted. I think he might have been able to get it anyway, but maybe not. But he didn't take that risk. He took the and you notice when I went through who's likely to win, I don't think he passes it. If he does, he gets 4 seats, and he could join either one. So Kachlon, ironically, even though he's been his party has really, aside from him, the best known member of his caucus is Michael Oren, who's not running in the next Knesset. So the one scenario is that, and I don't think Bibi would do this of his own volition, but I think that a government with blue and white and Likud would be a good government, and then everybody else could join it, because it would essentially have collectively 65, 66 seats, which is big. It's a large number. And there are a lot of natural allies who would want to join that government. I think that the problem with polarization is that it makes, it turns differences of opinion into visceral animosity. It used to be that if somebody disagreed with me, they were wrong. Now they're evil. They are evil, because they don't see the world the way I do, so they have to be evil. And if you don't believe me, listen to Rush Limbaugh, or listen to Rachel Maddow, or listen. You got these voices on the left, you got these voices on the right, but everywhere you listen, you hear extremism, and you're hearing that in Israel now too. And I'm saddened by it, because I think that national unity is a national security imperative, and you don't have that. And when people ask me what I think about Bibi and what I think about the corruption allegations, and what I think about bribery, and what I think about his rhetoric and his invective against the press and against the judiciary, and then I hear other people, we've had questions along these lines, only he can lead Israel, how could you replace such a great jockey? Yeah, jockeys are important, but the horse counts too. And as much as you like the jockey, if the jockey's suffocating the horse, then that's an issue. And I'm not saying Bibi's suffocating Israel or that Israel's a horse, but what I am saying is that any self-respecting democracy needs to consider term limits very carefully, because unfortunately power is addictive, and when you're addicted to something, you don't manage your medicine very well, and as a consequence, you're prone to a sense of entitlement, and this is not just true in Israel, it's true in America, it's true in, look at Roosevelt. Roosevelt ran, look, there's a war, I need to be president again. Okay, fine, well, there's still a war, I gotta run again, and God said, no, you don't. So a month later, he died. But I'm not wishing that on any politician, certainly in any country that we care about, but I do think that, look, Bibi's running, he's running for a 6th time. Does he win for a fifth term in office? I don't know. Likud's not going to get the most votes, but maybe because of the distortion of the Israeli electoral system, once again, the party that has the 2nd highest number of votes will be the one forming a coalition, and then you can ask yourself whether the plurality of voters were disenfranchised by seeing their party get the most votes, but not have a role in leading the country forward. So as a consequence of that, I think that the potential for a blue-white Likud-led coalition with other partners, and many other partners, that way the Orthodox can participate, and they should. They're a big part and fastest growing part of Israeli society, but they should receive benefits and participation in proportional terms. And then the Arabs could join, as they did in the early governments of Ben-Gurion, when there wasn't this tendency to consider them a 5th column. They're a 5th of the country. They're not a 5th column. Obviously, if you got to close your eyes and dream of a place where everybody thought like you and looked like you, it'd be pretty boring. But maybe it would feel safer for a little while. I am more troubled by the animosity that the process has driven than any potential outcome that I can foresee. And I do think that as a lot of people are waiting to see what happens on April 9th, I think that what's going to happen on April 9th, the range of outcomes is rather limited. In other words, there are only so many ways a piece can move on a chessboard. I think what's going to be extraordinarily interesting is what happens after April 9th. So for all the campaigning and all the slogans and all the electioneering that we're going to witness over the next 32 days, the more important negotiation and jockeying is going to take place thereafter. And a lot of it will depend on whether or not the Likud party is going to be led by Bibi or led by somebody else. And one of the downsides, one of the costs associated with being so vocal about your enemies and the leftists. Gantz is a leftist, Ya'alon is a leftist, and leftist is like a curse word in Israel. I mean, these are three chiefs of staff, but they're all cream puffs and wallflowers. I mean, it then makes it much more difficult, even in a place where politicians are as resilient as they are in Israel, to have productive coalition partnerships. So let's see how this plays out. I'm happy to take some questions. I have a hard stop at 1:30, but I welcome your input. Yes.
Who becomes the eventual? Who becomes the eventual winner if the initial winner can't form a government?
Very interesting question. For those of you who didn't hear it, who becomes the eventual winner if the initial winner can't form a government? So what the process is that after the election, every party that has representation in the new Knesset is invited to sit with the president and share its views on who it thinks the next prime minister ought to be. And then it's always been a he so far as presidents, then goes to the person who got the most support from these various parties and invites that person to form a government. If he or she is incapable of forming a government, then it would be the person who got the next highest number of commendations from the other people who sat with the president. It is possible that it's never happened before, that you get into such an extreme game of chicken. It sort of happened once before when Perez pulled off what was called the Tagil Matzliach, the dirty trick, when he had a coalition arrangement with Shamir that he then sabotaged, and Israel nearly had to go back to elections, but it didn't. It's theoretically possible that if no government could be formed, they throw it right back and have another election. But it hasn't happened before. I don't see that outcome happening, because anybody who has a stake, anybody who's done well enough to have a set of demands on the table, is going to feel pretty uncomfortable losing what they may have been able to acquire simply because they blinked first. Yes.
There is no limit to how many times they can run.
No, that's what I was saying earlier. The question is, are there no limits? Nope, there are no term limits in Israel. In the United States now, constitutionally, there are term limits for the president. You can only run 2 consecutive terms. You can run again, not consecutive, like Clinton, Obama could run if they wanted to in 2020. Both Clintons, actually. But both Obamas, too. But there are no term limits in the House and in the Senate, and in Israel, there are no term limits in the Knesset. Yes, David.
Let's say for now, he manages to put a government together, and then he has to go spend time in court, and he loses in court, goes to jail. What then?
So they'd have to give him a big cell to conduct cabinet meetings. Now, if he's actually convicted of bribery, he'll have to step down. If he's actually convicted, in other words, he can be charged, he can be prosecuted, and he can go through the entire appeals process. But once he's exhausted all of his appeals and he is convicted, which is why it would probably be tried by the Supreme Court in first instance, he would not have a lengthy appeals process. If he's convicted, he would have to resign as prime minister.
Do you think that the United States government is becoming very similar to the Israeli government? The United States government has a Democratic Party which is moving very much to the left, very much to the left.
So
you have four parties there that you say are very leftist.
So I heard your comment about the governments being similar. I don't think they're similar. I heard your comment about the Democratic Party in the United States moving to the left. That I agree with. And then you talked about 4 parties where in Israel that are leftist.
Yes.
No, there's one clear left-wing party in Israel, left-wing Zionist party, and that's Meretz. Three of the 4 Arab parties are left-leaning in terms of their socioeconomic inclinations. Labor, which historically was considered to be a left-wing party, isn't really that left. They're pretty centrist. But the entire political landscape in Israel has actually shifted to the right. So Labor is a much more capitalistic oriented party than historically it used to be, but it's a very truncated party. Remember, this was the flagship of the Israeli political system for the first 29 years and the mainstay for the next 40 years, and now they're likely to get 7 seats in the next Knesset, which means that they're at least the trends in the countries in the United States and Israel. The Democratic Party certainly is moving more towards the left. The social, progressive view of the world. In Israel, the general movement is in the opposite direction. Yes?
If Lapid gets 2.5, and Gantz gets 2.5, whatever you vote in a third time, what are you going to offer him?
So no, the question is if Lapid gets 2.5 years and Gantz gets 2.5 years. So that's not the deal. The deal is that Gantz gets 2.5 years and Lapid gets whatever's left. So it probably won't be 2.5 years because you got to call an election in about 4.5 years. 4.5 would be the most. Alon and Ashkenazi are not slated to participate in that rotation agreement. The rotation agreement is only between Gantz and Lapid. Yeah, they'll all get stuck. What? We'll see what happens the day after. You're raising a good point, and they haven't even gone to the election yet. But I think it's good news that they got a lot of these guys together, and then if they have a chance to govern, that'll be a separate set of challenges. Yes.
Could you comment on Tom Friedman's column yesterday in the New York Times?
Tom Friedman's column in the New York Times was when he basically tried to differentiate himself from Ilan Omar and use it as a platform to take a swipe at AIPAC. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. So Tom Friedman's article in the New York Times, he basically reminds readers that he's from the 5th District of Minnesota, the one that Ilan Omar now represents in Congress, and that Keith Ellison represented before her, who's now the Attorney General from Minnesota. That the St. Louis is a district outside of Minneapolis where a lot of Jews live, and then they brought in a lot of Somali immigrants. So it's sort of like the suburbs. Think of it as the Thornhill or the Côte St. Luc of Minneapolis. But for those of you who understand those references. So what he tries to do in a very Tom Friedman-like way is establish his credentials by coddling up to Ilan Omar and demonstrating how similar he is to her in terms of.
I think you're misrepresenting it.
Okay, maybe, but then he then says that she went too far because her comments were actually. This is how I read it, okay? I read it as him basically then saying she went too far. She's anti-Semitic when she starts saying that American politicians can be bought with Jewish money, and that the reason why we love Israel has not to do with the fact that our politicians have been paid off, but because Israel shares a set of values with the United States, and that its core essence is about democracy, about freedoms that shouldn't be taken for granted and don't exist in many other parts of the world. But then he couldn't get out of his own way when he wanted to criticize AIPAC, because he, like Ilan Omar, feels that AIPAC has just been a mouthpiece for the Israeli government, a mouthpiece for the Israeli Prime Minister, an obstacle to peace because of their support of the settlement program, which has basically been stuck in Friedman's craw for the past 40 years. That's how I read it. Yes.
Please comment on what would have to happen in Israeli politics for these two things to shift. One, a right at the wall area for men and women to play together, and two, I'm talking about some of the issues that have been raised from our FEMA, that and the couples that are making Aliyah, but one of the couples maybe hasn't converted by an Orthodox rabbi. So some of these two major things that we're struggling with, what has to happen in the shift of politics?
So very simply, it's just having less. Bibi. The joke when Clinton said, I smoked marijuana, but I didn't inhale. Bibi was caught eating a cheeseburger, but he didn't swallow. So he's not preventing egalitarian prayers at the Kotel because, or he's not preventing anything. But he reneged on a deal that he made to prevent egalitarian prayer at the Kotel because the Orthodox parties forced his hand. And the same is true for some elements of conversion law. As long as the ultra-Orthodox parties have disproportionate influence over Israeli politics, then
Asking how that shifts.
it shifts depending on the constitution, not the constitution of Israel, we'll talk about that separately, but the constitution of the coalition. In other words, if the next coalition either does not include the ultra-Orthodox or includes the ultra-Orthodox but doesn't need them to govern, which is eminently possible. I think the coalition should be as broad as possible, but not broader. Then they'll have to prioritize. They're not going to be able to get all the things they ask for. So then they have to say, can I stomach having mixed prayers outside the Western Wall Plaza, even though they're not trampling on me in my prayer area, if I get the money that I need for my schools, for my yeshivot. Now they don't have to make those choices. Now the governing coalition is dependent on the Orthodox to stay in power. So the answers are going to get this and they're going to get that. So the shift is only going to take place if they're either not part of a coalition or they're part of a coalition where they're not indispensable. Yeah, you asked the question. I'll get to you if there are any other questions people haven't asked yet? Yes. And then you, and then we're done. Yes.
What happened with Arovich? The testimony that he gave, was he ever indicted? Was he ever charged with any crimes?
So Alovich will I believe he will be charged as well, but he has not been charged yet. Moses has not been charged yet, but the case 4000, to the best of my knowledge, is the one. I don't think that any of the other cases we mentioned, certainly not 3000. Other people will have to answer for the German submarine transaction, but the BB related cases. I think the case 1000 is going to go away. I mean, Sarah Netanyahu, who was more involved in that and the champagne and the wine and everything else, charges against her were dropped on that. She's facing other charges still, but I think the Alovich case is going to the case 4000 with the Bezdek Walla merger and the other benefits that extended to Alovich. I think that's going to stay in the papers for a long time. Okay.
Just Caroline Blake, does she serve in any office now?
She's a writer. She writes for the Jews Post, but she's number 4 on the new right list. So according to the polling, she'll likely sit in the next Knesset. Yes, last question.
You said that Bibi is against the two-state solution. Now they're running against Trump and Kushner, who was for a two-state solution. What about the new government coming in?
So you're a lot better informed than I am. I don't know what Trump and Kushner are for.
Yes, they presented a two-state solution.
Did they? I missed that. Okay. They did? When?
Yeah, where part of Jerusalem goes to the new state.
Wow, you've got some inside information. That's pretty cool. All right. You want the microphone? Because I didn't know about that. They haven't presented their peace plan yet, and they certainly won't until way after a new government is formed. I think in his heart of hearts, Bibi Netanyahu is clearly not in favor of a two-state solution, even though he made a famous Bar Ilan speech 10 days after the President Obama spoke in Cairo in 2009. He felt that he needed to have less daylight between him and the President of the United States. So he had a famous speech where he said that his government would support a two-state solution, but nothing's really been done in that for a number of reasons. So maybe it's a combination of, I think, that certainly Bibi and the people around Bibi are not in favor of a two-state solution. The Likud party is increasingly adamantly in favor of a one-state solution. Certainly, Greater Israel being a Jewish state, and if there's going to be a second state or a Palestinian state, then let them have Jordan. And a lot of people feel that way. I mean, a cynic could say everybody believes in a two-state solution, but it should be Israel and Jordan, and Jordan should be the answer to the Palestinian national narrative. But wherever you are on the political spectrum, I think most people recognize that a lot of things have to happen before any putative Palestinian state is established. There's just too much too much uncertainty about what that state would look like, who it would be run by, what types of basic security measures would be available to Israel, where Israel can maintain a military presence in the Jordan Valley. There's just a lot of talk. I think the talk is good. I think it's better to talk than not talk. But I think from a practical standpoint, from an execution, implementation standpoint, I don't think we'll see a two-state solution for a while. I think that we really need to worry about the Jewish state and putting the borders aside. If there's any reconfiguration of land swaps at some point in the future, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Right now, I think what's critical is that Israel maintain its democratic character, maintain its very core basic respect for extremely cherished institutions, like a free press, like a rule of law, like a justice system that's extremely highly respected. It has to fight very hard to protect itself from critics, and when that criticism is leveled at it from the highest perch of government, it makes these very cherished institutions ever so more vulnerable. And I think that, pardon? It sounds like the States, that's exactly right. And it bothers me in the United States just as much as it bothers me in Israel. And like I said at the outset, we take a lot of things for granted, but we shouldn't. And when we start talking about what's going to happen on April 9th and thereafter, I'll go back to where I started. We need to just feel very, very, very fortunate that when Herzl launched the Zionist Congress, it was democratic. When we had the Asefat HaNivcharim in the Yishuv, there was no doubt that it was going to be democratic. When we had a Moetzet HaMedina Zmanit, the temporary provisional council, it was run as a democracy, and then the 20 Knessets ever since have all been democracies, and we hope it stays that way. Shabbat Shalom.